In this episode of Off the Shelf, we're going to talk about visual anthropology, how the discipline is defined and understood, a little bit of its history and methods, and finally some of what you might expect as a student and the types of careers that you might have with the background in the field.
I'm trying to tell you, I'm not your enemy, I'm a scientist.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
Visual anthropologists study human beings using visual data, like film and photography, which are used as supplements to other, more traditional forms of qualitative research. Today, visual anthropology also includes the study of the ways in which societies use and understand visual systems, in everything from art and architecture to commercial advertising, state propaganda, and even the organization of museums. So visual anthropologists don't just use visual technologies to document and study cultures around the world. They do that, it's really the field's bread and butter, but they also explore the production and reception of a huge variety of visual mediums in specific social contexts. Now, to really understand visual anthropology, we have to talk a little bit about its historical development. What are the stages that the field went through to become the discipline that it is today? And to answer that question, we have to first talk about ethnographic film. In a sense, visual anthropology originates from the earliest use of film and photography to document and study different cultural practices as part of the phenomenon of colonialism. In Paris in 1895, Félix-Louis Regnault used chronophotography to film a West African woman demonstrating traditional pottery-making techniques. He then combined that footage with an article on the speculative origins and diffusion of pottery making across the whole ancient world. His work was inaccurate, but for a lot of intellectual historians in the field, it's this combination of film and published anthropological writing that marks the origins of ethnographic film, using film as a form of data collection that can supplement qualitative research and writing, or as an ethnographic product in its own right. Building on Regnault's use of chronophotography, a number of early social scientific researchers began to integrate visual artifacts into their work. In particular, film and photography were used extensively in salvage ethnography to document cultures that were rapidly changing or being destroyed by the expansion of Euro-American colonial power and the processes of industrialization. In the 1920s and 30s, the development of more portable film cameras also led to the popularization of what we call explorer films, which were quasi-documentary projects filmed by explorers in exotic locations that were released to wide audiences. Explorer films were popular for a long time, but they were subject to very harsh critiques from both academic and indigenous communities that highlighted the fact that these films were sometimes scripted, used prefabricated sets, and were heavily edited, all of which compromised their value as sources for viable data and social scientific research. Later, in the decades following the Second World War, anthropologists using film were aware of these earlier problems and critiques, as well as being conscious of the Hawthorne effect. They understood that both their presence and the use of film cameras could alter their subjects' behavior, affecting their understanding of people's day-to-day lives. And they developed a variety of methods to try to improve the scientific value of their films. These included, for example, dramatically limiting the editing and narration in films to give viewers more of a sense of being there with the anthropologist. In Bitter Lemons, for instance, John Marshall films a series of songs composed and sung by a blind old man. He only tells us what the songs are called and then runs the camera, letting us see what he saw. The audience needs help understanding each song's significance, but we're allowed to experience them with minimal interference. This is very close to what we call observational cinema. By contrast, Jean Rouch adopted a completely different approach in the 1950s and 60s. He embraced the fact that the camera influenced his informant's behavior, and in films like Moi Noir, he collaborated with his subjects, allowing them to partially structure the film and play the roles of fictional characters that they designed for themselves. His approach to ethnographic film created a movement known as cinéma vérité, which helped to establish the French New Wave. Now, these are just two examples from many, but they show a reflexive effort to engage with how film shapes both the data collected as a field worker and the audience's engagement with film as a commercial and educational product. And it's that reflexivity that really conditions the emergence of visual anthropology as a field in the 1970s. I say the 1970s because the term visual anthropology was popularized by this book, Principles of Visual Anthropology, which was published in 1975. And this collection of essays focuses almost entirely on ethnographic film, trying to theorize the role that the camera plays as a social scientific instrument. And it shows that the field was dominated by ethnographic film at the time. What's happened since 1975, though, is that in the late 1980s and 90s, visual anthropologists began to reimagine the term visual in visual anthropology. The field grew from a relatively narrow focus on filmmaking and photography to an anthropological interrogation of visual culture, how visual culture influences us, shapes our identities, and drives aspects of the global economy. Say that you're a student interested in studying visual anthropology. This is why some study programs, like the master's track in visual anthropology at the University of Amsterdam, for example, take a broad, almost interdisciplinary approach to the subject. Students in visual anthropology are often trained in both traditional ethnography and the use of film and photography in the field. But the program also encourages students to experiment with new audiovisual vocabularies as research and educational tools, to take film, as Matthijs van der Poort says, and appropriate it on anthropological rather than commercial terms. Some other very well-known programs, like the Masters at the University of Manchester's Granada Center for Visual Anthropology, have a very pronounced emphasis on ethnographic filmmaking, in particular the significant technical and theoretical competences that you need to use film effectively in qualitative research. So, where you choose to study visual anthropology will also influence the ways in which you approach visual culture and use visual media as a social scientist. And you'll find links to both of those programs in the description below. Today, you'll see visual anthropologists working in a number of fields. There are multi-method qualitative researchers, documentary filmmakers, journalists, art historians and critics, and small business owners and innovators who work with visual media. Relative to its parent discipline, sociocultural anthropology, what visual anthropology gives students is an additional technical and theoretical proficiency that you can use as a social scientist, but that also has a broad appeal in the private sector. If you found that helpful, please do like and subscribe. It really helps us out. And if you're interested in visual anthropology, I'll put a few links to solid programs that I'm familiar with in the video description. And until next time, don't ever stop learning.